I saw this great cartoon this week. The title of it was Four Religious Truths. Here are the four religious truths. Number one, Muslims don't recognize the Jews as God's chosen people. Number two, Jews don't recognize Jesus as the Messiah. Number three, Protestants don't recognize the Pope as the leader of the Christian world. Number four, Baptists don't recognize each other at Hooters. It seems in all of those that grace is in short supply. This past week, Martha Forenski was telling me that she put one of the signs in her yard. No matter where you're from, we're glad you're our neighbor. Those signs that some of us have. That sign, for those of you that don't know, is in Spanish and in Arabic. She ordered a pizza, and the pizza delivery man came to her house, and he was just so happy. Normally, you don't think of pizza delivery men as being particularly happy when they come to your home. But he was just elated, and she said, hi, and he's like, I'm so happy. And she said, why? She said, because of your sign. And it's in a language I can read. Thank you. And just went on, and Martha said, I'm standing there like really happy, but my pizza's getting cold. But he was just so thrilled. Because grace is in short supply, so when you get it, you feel it. Yesterday morning, I was here for the MSJ retreat, and I was here early and in the parking lot, bringing some coffee into the Buckham room from the parking lot. There was a young man kind of looking around. So I let it go for a minute, and then he would look like, I didn't know quite what he was doing. I didn't recognize him. So I said, can I help you? He didn't answer me. So I took another step, said, can I help you with something? And he said with kind of threatening disdain, I don't need your help. I found grace in short supply in my own heart in that moment. So how much grace is enough? How much grace is required of me? How much grace is required of you? Last week, in our passage, Jesus said of himself, the Son of Man came eating and drinking, and you called him a glutton. We talked about a gluttonous spirituality, that Jesus was gluttonous, not because he ate in excess, but because he loved in excess. That there was not an excess of food, but an excess of grace. And grace seems to be at the heart of the story that we read in Luke's gospel today. First of all, you see Jesus calling Levi a tax collector, and he says, follow me. And the text says Levi got up, left everything, and followed him. So was Jesus just that charismatic? Just that electrifying? Was it an invitation, or was it a command? Was it, follow me? Or like, you, now? What was going on with Levi? Was he looking for an exit plan? Was he tired of his unsavory profession? Was he tired of being a moral and a social outcast? We have no idea. All we know is this. He responded, and not only did he follow, but he threw a party. Now, the party in this text wasn't the problem. Most of us love a good party. It was the guest list that was problematic. Tables were populated with people like Levi, the tax collector. And the Pharisees began to complain, not about the party, but about the guests. Now, it's unclear if the Pharisees were just looking on or if they were also on the guest list. We don't know that. Maybe they were just mad because they couldn't get to the food. But before we're too hard on the Pharisees, which we often are, let's try and see it from their point of view for a minute. The tax collectors worked for the Romans. And remember, at that time, Palestine was under Roman occupation. The Romans were the oppressors, the enemy. And while the Pharisees, yes, were complicit in the empire, they didn't work for the empire. And I'm sure they were very keen to point that out. The Romans were not only their enemies, they were God's enemies. Isn't that convenient? How all the people that we don't like, probably God doesn't like either. Okay, that was too close to home. I'll keep going. This was a boundary too great to cross. There were religious regulations about food, about purity, and who you could eat with. And clearly, this gathering broke every law, and some that weren't even written, but that were baked into the religious and social culture of the day. But Jesus didn't pay any attention to these religious and social codes. But we're not Jesus. I'm not, you're not. So, how much grace is enough? Now, if we're honest, when we throw a party and we're the host, we spend time on our guest list, don't we? We want to make sure we have a good party. We think, let's invite so-and-so. Oh, if we invite them, we can't invite this person because they don't really get along. And let's admit when we're the guest. You know how you get those evites? Tell me you haven't checked to see who else is coming before you replied yes or no. As the Baptists say, now I've gone from preaching to meddling. Okay. And the Pharisees complain about the guest list. Why do you eat and drink with these people? Now, anytime you start to hear anything that has this in the sentence, those people, why is Jesus eating and drinking with those people? Now, the Pharisees say this to Jesus' disciples, and I don't know whether he overhears them or what, but he responds, well, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick do. And I have come to call not the righteous, but the sinners. So basically, Jesus was saying, really my preference is sinners. I'd really rather hang out with them. And I think also that what Jesus was saying in that moment was a bit of turning things upside down. Now, who's righteous and who's a sinner? I know we don't use that language as much these days, but you can substitute your own words. Who is who? I think what really touched me deeply about this is that when you feel like you're righteous, you don't feel like you need any grace. And so then you're not as prone to give it. I felt righteous in the parking lot yesterday morning. What are you doing snooping around the church? I felt righteous at some level. So then I had to ask, what kind of grace should I give this person? Should I call the police? Should I? In Matthew's gospel, there's the exact same story, except the name is different. The name is Matthew instead of Levi. And Jesus says exactly the same thing, but he adds something according to Matthew. Jesus says, go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, from the prophet Hosea. I desire grace, not righteousness. How much grace is enough? I wonder if we only have to ask that question if we feel like we don't need grace ourselves. Because if you know you need grace, you don't ask that question about yourself. I don't know about you, but I'll take all the grace I can get because I need it. Daily. And truth is, I have not been as gracious lately as I could have been. Grace. Remember that movie, Little Miss Sunshine? If you haven't seen it, go home and watch it. It's a beautiful movie, Little Miss Sunshine, about a very, very dysfunctional family. If you ever want to feel good about your family, go ahead and watch that movie. And they have to go somewhere, and they go through a comedy of errors, to put it lightly. But they're going in a VW bus, and the clutch goes out at the very beginning of the journey. So every time they stop, they all have to get out and push the bus, the VW bus, to pop the clutch to go. And so then they get in kind of one at a time. So they're leaving a gas station that they stopped off, and everybody's trying to push, and they get a couple miles down the road, and they left Olive, the little one, behind at the gas station. She'd gone into the restroom. They were so busy pushing the bus, they didn't even notice. There's little Olive standing outside of she's like 8, standing outside of the gas station. And they're like, Olive, where's Olive? And then they, screech and turn around. They drive into the gas station. They open the side door, and they can't stop. So they're like, run, Olive, run. So she's running and hops in the VW bus just in time. And the dysfunctional uncle says, we leave nobody behind. No one gets left behind. It's kind of grace. At least that impulse. We don't leave anybody behind. Grace prompts us to embrace rather than exclude. Grace prompts us to humanize rather than demonize. And tell me if it is not true that we have become experts at demonizing in our culture. Flannery O'Connor is a Southern writer, and she has a short story called Revelation. One of those short stories that you read and it stays with you for a long time. And as I was thinking about grace, her story came to mind. It goes something like this. Mrs. Ruby Turpin and her husband Claude walk into the waiting room in a doctor's office. And Mrs. Turpin begins sizing up the clientele and the drab surroundings, and through the narrator's voice, we are privy to her incessant and acerbic judgments. She considers herself a righteous woman, a religious woman. In fact, she praises Jesus that she is not like some of the people in the waiting room. She's of another race and another class. A homeowner with property, in fact. Even if her husband does raise hogs, they're clean hogs. Mrs. Turpin was well rehearsed in her judgments, for sometimes late at night when she couldn't sleep, she would occupy herself by naming the classes of people in the appropriate order from the bottom up. Now, near her in this waiting room is a college-age young woman named Mary Grace. Fat, acne-scarred, white trash, reading a book on human development. Mrs. Turpin finds herself in a conversation with the girl's mother, but all Mary Grace does is glare at her as if she could read her mind. She has rightly pegged her as arrogant and smug, and for some reason, Mary Grace's unexplained and irrational wrath at Mrs. Turpin takes over, and in a violent outburst, she hurls her book across the room, hitting Mrs. Turpin in the head, knocking her out of her chair, and then jumping on her and digging her fingernails into her neck. She's pulled off, clearly having an illness as she begins to have a seizure. But Mrs. Turpin says, "What do you have to say to me?" Thinking that Mary Grace would apologize. Perhaps she shouldn't have asked that question, because The girl screams the vitriolic words, "Go back to hell where you came from, you old warthog." Later that day, Ruby Turpin cannot get the words out of her head. And she has a revelation. She sees the parade going into heaven and all those people in the waiting room, and their kind, they were in front of her, shouting, disheveled, disorderly, singing off key. And she and her kind were orderly and on key, but she was last. Mrs. Turpin had been struck by grace. And she never saw things quite the same again. Hopefully, our encounter with grace is not so painful. So we're not Jesus, and hopefully we're not Mrs. Turpin. It's so easy to see how Mrs. Turpin didn't have enough grace. It's only when we recognize that we ourselves need it that we will no longer ask ourselves the question, how much is enough grace? Mary Oliver reminds us the past is the past and the present is what your life is, and you are capable of choosing what will be. And so, dear friends, perhaps you've been in my place where you're feeling righteous and you don't think you need grace. Or perhaps you've also been in the place where you know how deeply you need it. Wherever you are in your journey today, you and I both need grace. And we're able to open ourselves to it, then we so more readily give it to others. This altar, this represents the party thrown by the tax collector, and this kind of the Pharisees. Extravagant, over the top. That's what grace is. Amen.